Strategy, a History by Lawrence Friedman, Oxford Press, 2013. Continuing with Max Weber and Social Science, Bureaucrats, Democrats, and Elites, page 303. During and just after the Great War, Weber delivered 2 lectures in Munich at the invitation of the Free Student Youth. The first, in November 1917, considered science as a vocation, and the second, in January 1919, politics as a vocation. Both are now considered landmark events in the history of social science. Weber had personally followed each vocation or calling, but science most successfully. Part of his challenge was to work out what one could do for the other. The objectivity of science and the partisanship of politics had to be kept separate. The professor, he insisted, should not demand the right to carry the marshal's baton of the statesman or reformer in his knapsack. This had an important consequence. Once values were excluded, social science could not generate a political theory on its own. Though his own views were strongly held, Weber avoided claiming that they were founded on science. By the end of the war, the strain of holding strong views while resisting the temptation to insist that they were scientifically based was evident. One of the audience at the 1919 lecture has described how, quote, "this gaunt, bearded man looked now like a prophet tormented by visions of disaster, now like a medieval warrior before leaving for battle," end quote. For different reasons, he did not make either the scientific or political vocations particularly appealing. Social science came over as especially forbidding, combining a highly disciplined work ethic with ascetic self-denial. As Weber stressed practical difficulties and the need for specialist expertise, he adopted conceptual formulations that were not always accessible. While the importance of science as a vocation came to be seen in Weber's emphasis on the fact-value distinction, he went beyond discussing the limits of scientific knowledge as a source of political values to how it might, quote, be employed to clarify the existence of facts and value in the world, and to aid thereby the selection of the means through which values should be pursued, end quote. In this way, science could serve strategy. Science could serve strategy by identifying the means necessary to achieve goals. Then it might be discovered that when faced with the appropriate means, they are, quote, such as you believe you must reject them, then you simply must choose between the end and the inevitable means. Does the end justify the means, or does it not? End quote. Science could not be a source of strategy because ends had to be identified by means of values which were outside its purview, but it could be of great strategic value by explaining why certain means might work or why certain ends were out of reach. The choice could be between the lesser evil or the relatively best. The interaction between science and values, effectively between means and ends, pointed not to their essential harmony, but to constant tension. In numerous instances, Weber observed, the attainment of good ends is bound to the fact that one must be willing to pay the price of using morally dubious means, or at least dangerous ones, and facing the possibility or even probability of evil ramifications. These dilemmas may now seem commonplace, but none before and few since have expressed them with such clarity, such an underlying conviction that no political system could ever resolve them definitively. This theme was picked up in the second lecture. The context was even darker. Now the war was over, but Germany was still reeling from the surrender to Allied armies of the previous November and subsequent revolutionary and counter-revolutionary activity. While there was no doubt about his personal vocation as a scientist, at this, his period of most active engagement, he displayed no special aptitude for politics. During the war, he had worried about overambitious and aggressive war aims and was unhappy that his country was fighting the United States. When the war historian Hans Delbrück organized a petition to counter one organized by more extreme academic nationalists, Weber signed up. In 1918, he returned to Germany from Vienna, where he had a visiting professorship and seemed ready to take on a leading political role. It did not happen. He was involved in the committee on the new constitution and played some part in the formation of the new centrist German Democratic Party, but he was given no senior role in its leadership. A biographer observed that his political understanding was not always the best, and his tiresome tendency to get bogged down in unnecessary and unproductive controversies is not exactly evidence of a born politician. As an active campaigner for the party, his tendency to lambast left and right alike in his speeches did not make him a natural coalition maker, just when a coalition was needed. After it became apparent in 1920 that he was not going to be a major player, he withdrew from the party leadership, observing, quote, "The politician should and must make compromises, but I am a scholar by profession. The scholar does not need to make compromises or to cover folly," end quote. The political vocation was not for him. Sentimentally, that he remained attached to the notion of a strong German state, was hostile to pacifism, and was angered by the sudden surge of revolutionary activity, despite the involvement of a number of his friends. He feared the demilitarization of the country, which would leave it powerless, and was annoyed at the disorder fomented by the revolutionaries. When he spoke in Munich, it was not long after the murder of the Spartacist leaders Luxemburg and Liebknecht, an action that he deplored, though he had also recently expressed his irritation with the two theorists. Liebknecht belongs in the madhouse and Rosa Luxemburg in the zoo, he wrote. He had only agreed to give the lecture because he feared that if he did not, the lectern would be taken instead by Karl Eisner, the radical head of what Weber considered to be an incompetent Bavarian government. This was a time when the dilemmas of political life were thrown into sharp relief. Defeat in war and convulsive revolutions illuminated how imperfect could be the fit between ends and means. It led Weber to present an analysis that went to the heart of the tensions in strategic thinking, insisting on the pointlessness of lofty goals if there was no means of achieving them. He continued to stress the need to analyze means by reference to their consequences. Weber opened his lecture with his customary refusal to take a position on actual problems of the day. This was followed with compelling definitions of politics and the state. Politics was about, quote, the leadership or the influencing of the leadership of a political association, hence today of a state, end quote. As the state could not be defined by its ends, for there were many possibilities, it had to be defined by its means, quote, namely the use of physical force. By this, he was not saying that force was the normal or only means available to the state, just that it was specific to the state. The state was therefore defined as a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. Only the state could legitimize violence. Once that monopoly was threatened, as it was both externally and internally at that time, then the state was in trouble. The state's authority could come from one of three sources: tradition, bureaucracy, or charisma. As tradition was no longer available and bureaucracy was too narrow, Weber looked to charisma, by which he meant a certain quality of political leadership, the ability to gain authority through sanctity, heroism, or exemplary character. Charisma was a political quality defining a leader's separate role from a civil servant. The politician must be prepared to take a stand, to be passionate, while the civil servant must execute conscientiously the order of the superior authorities exactly as if the order agreed with his own conviction. The issue was how would power best be exercised? What kind of a man would one be if he is allowed to put his hand on the wheel of history? The choice was between an ethic based on convictions, ultimate ends, and one based on responsibility, between acting according to underlying principle, even if this was detrimental to the cause, and acting according to the likely outcome. The lecture challenged those who refused to compromise on principle, the intellectuals in this carnival we decorate with the proud name of revolution, for their empty romanticism, devoid of all feeling of objective responsibility. Refusing to think about outcomes gave evil its opportunities. He scorned the revolutionaries whose actions favored their forces of reaction and oppression, yet blamed others. Pure motives were not enough if they led to bad consequences. Those who at that time in Germany sought, quote, to establish absolute justice on earth by force, end quote, a number of whom were presumably in his student audience, should think about what this would mean. Could they be sure that their followers shared the same agenda? Might not this really be about the emotions of hatred, revenge, resentment, and the need for pseudo-ethical self-righteousness, or else about a desire for adventure, victory, booty, power, and spoils? Could such followers be kept sufficiently rewarded and motivated? Would doing so contradict the original motives and objectives of the leaders? Would not this emotional revolutionism therefore eventually give way, probably quite soon, to the traditionalist routine of everyday life? If the revolutionaries really thought the problem was the stupidity and baseness of the world, how did they think they were going to eradicate it? He challenged the pacifism of the Sermon on the Mount. The politicians, he insisted, must take the opposite view, for without resistance he was responsible for the evil winning out. So Weber was speaking up for an ethic of responsibility which recognized from the start the deficiencies of others and evaluated actions in terms of likely consequences. Yet he also worried about a politics focused purely on immediate effects without an underlying cause to give it meaning. His ideal was one in which the ethic of ultimate ends and responsibility came together in a genuine man, a man who can have the calling for politics. Here he was looking for the charismatic figure, a hero as well as a leader, who would not crumble when the world, from his point of view, is too stupid or too base for what he wants to offer. He was not optimistic. Quote, "Not summer's bloom lies ahead of us, but rather a polar night of icy darkness and hardness, no matter which group may triumph externally now." End quote. He urged a politics based on both passion and perspective, for man would not have attained the possible unless time and again he had reached out for the impossible. Weber's distrust of actions based on purity of motive rather than assessment of consequences reflected confidence in the ability to assess consequences and the role of scientific research in facilitating such assessments. Social action might always remain something of a gamble, but the odds could be shortened by formulating a reasonable hypothesis on what might be expected from alternative courses of action. Without this confidence, how is one proposed course of action to be assessed against another?